Berkeley paleontologist Kevin Padian is an expert on the evolution of flight and the anatomy of pterosaurs.
First thing to know about pterosaur bones is that they have the thinnest bones of any vertebrates. This one's squashed completely flat, flat as a pancake. And it's like it was just like it was run over by an 18-wheeler sometime in the Cretaceous there in the middle of the ocean, right? And it's a this bone comes from the upper arm like this. It's squashed completely flat. The bone wall is so thin, it's about the same dimension as the wall of a dirter. A dirter is one of those things you get at the end of the paper towels, the cardboard thing in the middle, you go dir in it. Well, that's what this thing is like, except there's nothing in the middle of it. I mean, it's just completely air-filled, and it's squashed flat, and the bone walls are very, very thin. Now, you might think this would make it a very weak bone, but in fact, we checked this out with some engineers at Stanford, and we're working with them, and they showed us that, in fact, the big diameter of this arm is what really makes it strong.
Despite its hollow center, the thickness of the walls of the pterosaur bones enabled them to withstand the forces of flight. Calculations show that pterosaur bones are up to 86% stronger than similar mammal bones. Scientists agree that even the enormous pterosaurs could fly. But how? 200 million years ago, a great sea covered this area in southern Germany. Animals living along its shore would fall in, die, and become buried by the fine, silty deposits. Over millions of years, these deposits would harden into a smooth limestone. For centuries, this limestone had been quarried to make tiles and artist stones. But in the late 1700s, something unusual was pulled from this quarry. A strange and twisted fossil with the body and head of a lizard. Its long, curving fingers were simply incomprehensible, almost dragon-like. It landed, as interesting fossils of the day often did, on the desk of Georges Cuvier, the brilliant French anatomist. If restored to life, he wrote, the fossil would resemble nothing in the modern world. In the early 1800s, a time that knew nothing of extinction, Cuvier's contention was revolutionary. It was the seed of an idea that would become a fundamental principle of evolutionary theory. Cuvier named the creature Pterodactylus, or wing finger. To him, it was clear that this extraordinarily elongated last finger bone had supported some kind of wing. Scientists tried to explain how a primitive reptile could ever retain the advanced powers of flight. The verdict was that they could fly, barely. Otherwise, they'd still be around. Paleontologist David Unwin of the University of Bristol, England, has studied the evolution of the pterosaurs.
For many, many years, people thought that it was really a poor kind of flyer. They thought these animals were only capable of hurling themselves from cliffs and crashing to the ground and then sort of staggering back up again and doing the whole thing over.
At the turn of the century, the English geologist H.G. Seeley wrote a popular book called Dragons of the Air. After studying pterodactyls for decades, Seeley argued they were extraordinarily sophisticated, warm-blooded flyers. His opinions did not prevent the pterodactyl's fall from grace. Science decided that the first experiment in non-insect flight was an abysmal failure.
Professor Seeley at Cambridge in the 1870s had a magnificent monograph about pterodactyl joints and how they moved, and he said these were hot-blooded like birds and powerful flyers, very agile and able critters. Then in the 1930s, the pendulum swung, and people said they're not hot-blooded, they didn't have good joints, they had weak wings, they just could barely soar in the air, and the least little turbulence would send them fluttering around like a poorly designed Air Force production.
The pterosaur's flight into obscurity would last almost 50 years. Then a generation of scientists raised on Hollywood's image of these creatures would take a fresh look at them. Pterosaurs went from evolutionary failures to pioneers of flight. It was the first time on Earth that an animal other than insects developed the ability to fly. The predecessors of these winged reptiles appear about the same time as early dinosaurs, 225 million years ago. Paul Sereno has found some of the earliest fossils ever discovered, pushing back the family tree for dinosaurs, and now, quite possibly, for pterosaurs.
And so we think that pterosaurs are not modified dinosaurs, but arose from a different kind of reptile nearly the same time. If you went up to the family tree of dinosaurs and took the whole tree off, pterosaurs would not be in your hand. They're outside that.
Scientists have nothing to compare the pterosaurs to. The only other backboned animals that can fly are birds and bats. Since the 19th century, paleontologists believe that pterosaur wings were bat-like, leathery, stretching between 4 elongated fingers and their feet. Bats' wings attach to their hind legs, making bats strong flyers, but presenting a burden once they've landed. On the ground, bats walk on 4 legs, awkwardly lifting their wings off the ground. David Unwin supports the bat-like view of pterosaurs.
And basically the hind limbs are sprawling out sideways and the feet are sort of turned right out like this. And then the forelimbs came down and they had 3 little fingers and claws on the ends down there, and they put these down on the ground, and they had the enormous great wing finger would be spreading up round and over the back, and they moved along rather slowly and very laboriously. Remember, they have wing membranes attached to their hind limbs and going between their hind limbs, so they move along quite slowly and laboriously, and they certainly didn't move very fast at all when they were on the ground.
Other scientists believe pterosaurs were 2-legged and bird-like, with narrow wings attached at the hips, leaving their hind legs unencumbered for walking. Paleontologist Kevin Padian demonstrates.
Pterosaurs walked like birds and the other dinosaurs. And the reason we know this is they have their pelvies and their hind limbs set up like the feet of dinosaurs and birds. They have thigh bones in which the head of the thigh, the femur, comes right into the socket like this, very much like our femora. Now, if you just look at our femora, which has this big ball and socket joint, we could stick our legs out like this and we could walk like that. But in fact, we don't do that. How do we know that? We look at the rest of the leg. And in pterosaurs and birds, they have this femur that goes out like this, and they have a knee joint here. They have very long shin bones. They have an ankle that only works like a hinge in this direction. So they have to walk pretty much like this, very much like birds do. And they also walked on their toes. So they put one foot in front of the other. They're slightly toed inwards, like birds, like dinosaurs.
The fossil record doesn't contain a perfectly preserved soft tissue imprint that could answer the question of bird-like or bat-like anatomy. Paleontologist Chris Bennett feels that comparisons to birds and bats will never sufficiently explain the remarkable fossils of the pterosaurs.
I think we could learn a lot about pterosaurs by comparing them to the living flying animals, birds and bats. But I also think that the pterosaurs are as different from birds as they are from bats, and probably as different from those two as birds and bats are different from each other. And I think basically pterosaurs are pterosaurs.